Thank you. I'm Marvin Fertel. I'm the President and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I want to once again thank you for joining us this morning for our annual briefing on the status and the outlook for nuclear energy. When I briefed you last February, we had nearly reached the one-year mark after the Fukushima accident, and the industry was moving aggressively to identify and implement the major lessons learned. As you know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission found no immediate safety concerns with America's reactors, but it's standard practice in the nuclear industry to review all operating events, from minor incidents that you never hear about to major accidents like Fukushima, and to look for ways to make our facilities even safer. The industry and the NRC are in broad agreement on the higher priority actions that should be taken in America's reactors, and we expect the implementation costs for these actions to be reasonable. The NRC is considering additional actions whose safety benefits are less clear in our minds, and we're working with the agency to ensure that we focus on the issues that are most important to safety. Safety is the industry's highest priority, and we are committed to continue to operate at exemplary levels of safety to maintain the far-reaching benefits of nuclear energy. Nuclear power plants produce nearly two-thirds of America's carbon-free electricity. Each of our 104 reactors creates hundreds of millions of dollars in direct and indirect revenue for state and local economies, and together they represent tens of thousands of good jobs throughout the U.S. economy in building, operating, and supporting the plants. This morning we'll review the status of the operating fleet, the response to the Fukushima accident, new plant development, and the industry's policy priorities. I'll close with some thoughts on the long-term outlook for nuclear energy. The long-term fundamentals continue to support this technology, and while the current electricity market is challenging, we're confident that the long-term prospects for nuclear energy are still very good. Let me start by giving you a snapshot of the industry's operating performance. Overall, it has been a solid year for America's nuclear power plants. We estimate that our average capacity factor for 2012 was 86.4%. That estimate includes the extended shutdown of 4 reactors, Crystal River, Fort Calhoun, and San Onofre Units 2 and 3. Crystal River and Fort Calhoun did not operate at all last year, and the Songs reactors operated just briefly in January before shutting down. If we exclude them, we get an average capacity factor of about 89.2%. And all things considered, I think it's fair to say that the industry continues to operate at around 90%, as it has for the past decade. We continue to invest in these facilities to preserve their asset value, to position them to operate beyond 40 years, perhaps more than 60 years, and to incorporate new requirements and upgrades to maintain the highest levels of safety. We don't have 2012 data yet, but in 2011, the industry invested $7.6 billion in the plants. We placed these reactors in service in a relatively short time period, so we will experience these periodic peaks in capital spending. The industry's capital spending in 2011 included $3.8 billion for steam generators, reactor vessel heads, power uprates, and other enhancements that improve the lifetime operation of the plants. $1.8 billion spent on routine maintenance, including the replacement or refurbishment of equipment, and $1.5 billion related to regulatory matters such as security, spent fuel storage, and emergency preparedness. The NRC has reviewed the operating licenses for 73 reactors and is currently reviewing renewal applications for 13 more. One constant for our industry is our commitment to safety. Major events are rare, so most measures of safety focus on lesser precursor events that are usually resolved well and quickly. The most recent report from the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Industry Trend Program, was published in April of 2012. The report identified no significant adverse trends in industry safety performance during fiscal year 2011. The NRC has issued most of its requirements related to the post-Fukushima recommendations identified as highest priorities, or Tier 1, and the industry is implementing requirements in addition to other proactive steps taken by the companies themselves. The NRC's top requirements are, first, maintaining cooling and containment integrity at multiple reactors at a single site during a severe natural event, enhancing spent fuel pool instrumentation, reevaluating potential seismic and flooding hazards. The results of these reevaluations will be very site-specific, ensuring reliable and accessible hardened vents for boiling water reactors, reevaluating emergency communication systems and staffing levels, and conducting rulemakings on station blackout and emergency preparedness. Next month, the owners of 22 plants are scheduled to submit their revised flooding hazard evaluation to the NRC. Evaluations for the remaining plants are due next year and the year after. As you may know, the NRC staff has recommended filtered containment vents for most boiling water reactors. The Electric Power Research Institute concluded that filtered vents aren't necessarily the most effective way to filter potential radioactive releases from fuel damage. We believe the optimal filtration method should be determined on a plant-specific basis. The NRC's Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards shares this view, and we believe our solid technical arguments will prevail. The post-Fukushima actions are not the only regulatory requirements facing our industry. The industry and key members of Congress have urged the NRC to assess the cumulative impact of regulatory activities to ensure that the issues most important to safety get top priority, and that NRC and industry resources and attention are not diverted by matters of lesser importance. We think the greatest safety improvement by far comes from the industry's flex approach. As I mentioned last year, this approach provides a comprehensive, tailored capability to respond to extreme events, regardless of the cause. The heart of this effort is adding more portable, backup safety equipment at various locations at each plant. We have produced a short video that explains and illustrates the flex approach. A link to the video is in your packets. In addition to new equipment being purchased for all 65 sites, the industry is developing 2 regional response centers, one in Memphis and one in Phoenix. They will serve as dispatch points for additional equipment and resources if needed. So we will have a total of 67 sites around the country with backup portable safety equipment that can be deployed in an emergency. In addition, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations has upgraded its emergency response center, and that facility is operational today. INPO will facilitate the sharing of equipment and expertise whenever and wherever it is needed. Nearly 1,500 pieces of equipment have been acquired or ordered, including large portable generators and diesel-driven pumps. The industry saw a temporary downturn in public support after the Fukushima accident. When I briefed you last year, public support had rebounded from a low of 46% in April 2011, just a month after the accident, to 62% in September 2011. Favorability ratings continued an upward trend buoyed by high public ratings for safety at America's reactors. 7 out of 10 members of the public give high safety marks to our reactors. By September 2012, support had risen to 65% and was at 68% in a survey conducted for NEI last week. Let me turn now to new nuclear plant development. The Tennessee Valley Authority continues work on a $4.2 billion project to complete Watts Bar 2 and plans to have the reactor operating by 2015. The Vogtle and Summer projects in Georgia and South Carolina continue to make good progress. As you know, these advanced AP1000 designs are being built under a new licensing process, and both the NRC and the companies are on a learning curve, addressing issues that could not be fully anticipated and resolved until you are in the process as we are today. Significant early site work has been completed, major component construction and assembly is well along, and the operators for these state-of-the-art reactors are being trained in accredited programs. The video that was playing as you walked in this morning shows the progress of work at the Vogtle site. In addition to Vogtle and Summer, 10 applications for combined construction and operating licenses and 2 for early site permits are currently under review by the NRC. We don't expect construction on any of these projects to start until much later this decade. We're also seeing growth in the domestic fuel supply sector as Louisiana Energy Services doubles its enrichment capacity at its New Mexico facility. This picture shows preparation for pouring the 6-foot-thick concrete base mat for Vogtle 3 this year. Not far behind is the summer project, where rebar is also being placed for the base mat and the containment vessel is being fabricated. I know your major interest is the United States, but let's not forget that nuclear energy is a global enterprise with multinational ownership of major suppliers and a global supply chain. Around the world, we're seeing major growth in nuclear energy. 71 reactors are currently under construction, including the 5 in the United States I've already mentioned, and more than 160 reactors are on order or planned. The global market for commercial nuclear technology is a tremendous opportunity for U.S. vendors and suppliers, and America's participation in this market provides value well beyond the purely business aspect. U.S. nuclear energy technology is a strategic instrument of America's foreign policy. The Department of Commerce estimates that the global market, including fuels and services, could be as large as $750 billion over the next 10 years. Every $1 billion of export represents between 5,000 and 10,000 jobs here. The international nuclear energy business is very competitive, and U.S. suppliers generally compete against state-owned enterprises, which makes the business even more challenging. We made this area a priority several years ago, and I'm pleased to say that we're making some progress. We've urged our government to improve the coordination, integration among the many government agencies with a role in U.S. nuclear export policy. The Departments of State, Energy, Commerce, the Export-Import Bank, etc. Last year, the Obama administration created a position in the National Security Council to drive greater integration, and that is beginning to pay some dividends. We're also seeing senior government officials acting as ambassadors for America's industry, like their counterparts in France and Russia. The Czech Republic has a tender open for new reactors, and former Secretary of State Clinton was in Prague late last year supporting the case for American suppliers. Still, we have unfinished business in this area. Our export control regime is unnecessarily complex and cumbersome. Approvals that take a few weeks or months in other countries can take a year or longer in the United States. And we have important nuclear energy trade agreements coming up for renewal, including South Korea and China, and some major new agreements being negotiated with Saudi Arabia, for example, which represents well over $100 billion in business potential. Also, there's more at stake here than jobs and trade revenue, as important as those are. The United States must succeed in the world market to maintain its leadership in nuclear technologies, to export our safety culture and excellent operational expertise, and to increase our influence on nonproliferation policy and practices. Let me share a few thoughts about policy issues and priorities. The election brings a revamped Obama administration and a new Congress, but with no dramatic changes expected at either end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We continue to have a solid base of bipartisan support in Congress, but we do not anticipate significant movement on nuclear energy issues. We expect Congress will continue to be focused on the deficit, federal spending, and taxes. We do expect continued congressional oversight of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and for the Senate to consider the expected renomination of Chairman Allison McFarland to a second term at the NRC. As I mentioned, we expect the administration will send Congress several agreements for nuclear cooperation, either to renew existing agreements or execute new ones. So look for hearings on those in this Congress. The industry in Congress and the executive branch are laying the groundwork for legislation focused on the nation's nuclear waste management program. There is some support in Congress for legislation to implement recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. We don't expect to see legislation passed this year, but we do expect members of Congress will begin the process of developing a consensus on what needs to be done. We're already hearing the early stages of those discussions, including from state public utility commissioners, who are pressing the federal government to uphold its legal responsibilities to manage used nuclear fuel. The industry supports creation of a new management organization with access to the Nuclear Waste Fund and its ongoing collections. We support development of consolidated storage facilities at voluntary sites and the development of a permanent disposal facility. We continue to believe that NRC and DOE should complete the licensing for the proposed repository at Yucca Mountain, Nevada, and we're expecting a court decision on that issue shortly. Finally, as you know, last year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit vacated the NRC's 2010 waste confidence finding. The court found fault with some specific NRC environmental analyses. The NRC is preparing a new environmental impact statement and expects to complete that and issue a new waste confidence rule by August of 2014. In the meantime, the agency continues its ongoing reviews of applications for license renewal and new plant licenses. Because of the NRC's timetable for the rule, we don't believe the waste confidence issue should have any material impact on the industry. I'd like to close with some thoughts on the outlook for nuclear energy. As I said earlier, the global market for commercial nuclear technology is large and growing, and that can mean business and revenue for companies in the United States and hundreds of thousands of more jobs here at home. The International Energy Agency forecasts that demand for electricity will grow faster than demand for any other form of energy between 2010 and 2035, expanding by more than 70% in that period. More than 80% of that growth will occur in non-OECD countries. As an example, the growth in China's electricity demand through 2035 is greater than today's electricity demand in the United States and Japan combined. Low-carbon baseload electricity is a crucial element of sustainable development and is why many nations are building or planning to build more nuclear energy facilities. Here at home, despite today's low natural gas prices, little or no growth in demand for electricity and soft power markets in the near term, we believe the long-term prospects for nuclear energy remain strong. The value proposition for nuclear energy is strong and will reassert itself as we move beyond the near-term issues. This value proposition starts with the production of large quantities of electricity around the clock, safely and reliably when needed, but the value proposition doesn't end there. Nuclear power plants also provide a clean air compliance value. For example, in a cap-and-trade system, nuclear energy reduces the compliance burden that would otherwise fall on emitting generating sources. Nuclear energy also provides voltage support to the grid, without which grid stability could become a real problem. It provides very good forward price stability and is not subject to the price volatility associated with natural gas-fired generating capacity in particular. It contributes to an important fuel and technology diversity that is one of the bedrock characteristics of our reliable and resilient electric sector. And it provides large numbers of high-paying jobs, larger numbers and higher paying than any other source of electricity. And it anchors the local tax base. As an example, when the Kewaunee plant closes later this year, Wisconsin will lose 556 megawatts of emission-free electricity. In addition, the plant represents almost 15% of the employment in Kewaunee County and 30% of the county's revenue base. These are the unrecognized values of nuclear energy. They are not monetized by markets, but they exist nonetheless. So as our nation's economy recovers, as we build new generating capacity to meet new electricity demand and to replace our aging infrastructure, as we continue to replace direct burning fossil fuels with electricity in manufacturing and at our nation's ports and in our transportation sector, as we continue to limit emissions of criteria pollutants like SOx, NOx, mercury, and particulates, and reduce the electric sector's carbon footprint, we believe this value proposition will become increasingly self-evident and will drive a bright future and long-term for nuclear energy. I thank you for being here this morning, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have on what I said or what I didn't cover. So thank you. When?
You didn't mention cyber. Oh, sorry. You didn't mention cybersecurity, and I'd like to know, have any plants been hacked into, and what are you doing to make sure that the plants are not hacked into and closed down?
Okay. So cybersecurity, clearly a very big issue in our country. No plants, quote, have been hacked into by bad people trying to do anything. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has requirements for us to do things to protect the plants from a cyber attack. And all of the plants have implemented those requirements by the end of last year. Each plant actually has a cybersecurity plan that's been approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So in addition to what we're doing at our plants from a nuclear standpoint, there's a very strong dialogue going on right now between the electricity sector, including us from a nuclear standpoint, and our government, with meetings occurring at very high levels, including, Secretary Napolitano and Secretary Chu, on sharing of information. The utility sector has gotten very high-level classified briefings on threats to the electric utility sector. And as the President's executive order that just came out emphasized, for better communication and sharing of information, we're seeing that beginning to happen with the government. Okay, it hasn't been happening in the past. It's hard to deal with threats that you don't know about or use technologies that they have that they don't share. So I think, Glenn, not just on nuclear plants, but I think for the whole electric sector, we're going to see an enhanced ability to address cyber issues because of the new openness we're seeing with our government. But at our nuclear plants, we've been very aggressive because we are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, besides the fact that we want to make sure the plants are safe. Paul?
I wanted to sort of follow up on Kewaunee and the merchant power market and how that's impacting nuclear plants. There was an article in the Chicago Tribune on Friday from a very large nuclear operator indicating that if the wind production tax credit continued, that he might have to shut down plants, at least according to the article. You mentioned Kewaunee. Clearly, and you also mentioned the benefits it had that aren't really being monetized in the market. So I'm wondering, do you see a risk of further closures? And where should we think about those as investors? And also, how do you see the potential for maybe getting some monetization for those sort of longer term attributes that these plants might be providing, but isn't going to get any market value right now? I mean, can you address sort of, I know it's sort of a big topic, but what can you say about it?
Let me start maybe with the back end and work up to the front end of your question. I think it's going to be hard to get things monetized very quickly because we've had competitive markets for a decade now, and these values on grid stability and capacity additions have always existed, and we haven't seen them monetized very effectively yet in the marketplace. Having said that, I think part of what we're trying to do with what we're saying is get it better understood and appreciated at the state level as well as the federal level. Because if the governors understand what they're losing, which isn't just the power plant. I mean, we're shutting down 70,000 megawatts of fossil plants between last year and 2017. We're replacing them with gas probably. But you don't lose the same thing when you shut down an old coal plant as you lose when you shut down a nuclear plant, even a small one. So I think part of our effort right now is we'd love to get it monetized, but it's to get it understood politically. Because one way of getting it dealt with is for the politics to want the plant to keep operating. Because states can do things that allow that to happen if they actually look to do that. So it's right now in our mind, we haven't done a good job in educating on these values, be it the jobs, be it the economic value, be it the grid reliability. I think on your beginning of your question about plants that are challenged from an economic standpoint, I think that in merchant markets you have plants that are challenged, and just as we're seeing business decisions, and Exelon made a business decision on Oyster Creek, a year and a half ago, based upon the fact that they were seeing cooling towers being imposed, and it didn't make any sense from their standpoint to economically operate beyond 2019, even though their license could. I think Dominion's decision wasn't at Kewaunee. Kewaunee's been an excellent operating plant. I mean, and Dominion put a lot into it to make it an excellent operating plant. But it wasn't part of their core business, and because of both the market and the absence of a PPA, selling it became difficult. So I think, Paul, it's going to be individual cases. If it's not part of your core business, it's more vulnerable than if it is part of your core business, because everybody expects gas prices aren't going to stay at $2 or $3. And gas prices this week, I'm sure, with the storm that you all had, we're probably in the $25 to $30 range in New England and parts of New York. I know it was that much just a couple of weeks ago when we had the cold snap. So depending upon where you are, gas prices don't stay at $2 or $3, and gas companies don't make a lot of money at $2 or $3.
Give us a sense as to how many megawatts might be at risk for a Kiwani scenario?
Not really, because I think that each one of these is a business decision. I mean, you probably have looked harder at the plants personally as to who's in a merchant market. Are they small? Do they have a PPA? And could probably list the ones you want. I think those are factors that put you into a bin to look at, and then it's what's the company's strategy, and how does that plant fit into it? If you're running a big fleet, you have plants that may not be doing so well, but maybe 2 years from now they're doing very well. So I think that it's a hard call. It's an easier call on fossil plants. I know I'm going to have to make a major investment on scrubbers or mercury reduction. Do I want to do that, or do I want to replace it with something? I think it's actually an easier call on a coal plant.
Hi, good morning. It's Andy Levy at Avon Capital. On Santa Onofre, there's been a lot in the press the last week. Maybe you can address that as far as accusations by some congressional members like Markey and Barbara Boxer. And also if you can maybe talk about the need of a possible license amendment there, or no need for a license amendment, and just a general update from what you're hearing on the whole process for songs.
Okay, so Senator Boxer and Congressman Markey sent a letter questioning a MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry root cause report, and some of the content. I have not looked at the report, so I don't know whether the statements are accurate even on what they said. The NRC has their Office of Investigation looking at that. They will complete their review and report out to the Commission whether they saw anything wrong there. The NRC staff had the report since the fall, so it's not a report that had been hidden from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The question is, did Senator Boxer and Congressman Markey identify something that shows that there was bad behavior on either the NRC's part or the licensee's part? I personally can't tell you they did or they didn't. I doubt there's any bad behavior. I mean, they've done an awful lot of work to try and make sure that no one's going to spend $700 million on steam generators knowing they're not going to work. No one's going to risk their plant for it. So I can't imagine that there's something that was known that would have forecast the type of problem that they're having, and they would have gone forward. So I would almost dismiss out of hand that people went forward knowing the problem. You just can't imagine that with the reviews that you do. So I think we'll hear sometime soon when they finish their OI investigation. My understanding on restarting the unit at 70% power, from at least the look that I've done on that, I don't see any reason they need a license amendment. I think that they have processes in place that should allow them to restart it. In fact, what you ought to be doing is make sure they don't go above 70. I'm allowed to operate my safety envelope at 100% power. I should be allowed to operate within my safety envelope at something below that. My understanding is that the hang-up is a process hang-up on a technical specification wording, and I think it should be solved without a license amendment, personally. Call?
Marv, I think you did a great job in outlining the value proposition of nuclear, but I think at the same time you also outlined what's keeping it from being monetized. Now, my question to you is it the responsibility of NEI or of any other organized and paid-for group of advocates to bring the value proposition versus the non-value, let's say, proposition to the attention of state and federal regulators? Or like EPRI, are you out of the fray in terms of any kind of political activity?
Yeah, I think, Carl, as I said to the first question, I think what we're going to try and do is a lot better educating of the political process at state and local, that there are real consequences. There are real value, first of all, and then consequences to decisions to shut down nuclear plants. And that state and local may have a much better ability to preserve those assets than the federal government trying to do something at the federal level. So I think that we are going to really try to educate on that at the state and local level. We won't give up on the federal level, and we'll work closely with the Edison Electric Institute, who would love to see markets work better themselves. But I think that our focus here will be to get state and local folks to understand value.
Is part of that the additional license extension for the next 20 beyond the 50?
Well, I think we're trying to get our understanding of greater than 60. You know, we're going to lose a lot of plants, even with the 60, when we get to the latter part of the next decade. We go through a real cliff on a lot of plants having their 60-year license expire. And I think right now we're working with EPRI and the NRC to define the requirements for greater than 60. What are the issues that have to be resolved at greater than 60, and we're working hard with that so that companies will know, because to be honest, 10 years before that, they're going to have to start to really get into that process if they want to. So we are going to look at that. We are looking at that, and that will be part of the game plan.
Could you talk about the waste confidence finding and the new rule that you said the NRC would issue in August of 2014. Will that be a final rule?
Yeah.
And then after that's issued, can they go forward and issue the license extensions? Because
Yeah.
I think right now they're all pending until that time.
Yeah, because waste confidence, the waste confidence rule was vacated, the commission directed the staff, continue all the reviews, you just can't issue the final new plant license or license renewal. Okay, so you can't send it out the door, but you can get up to sending it out the door. Okay, so they're doing that. It will be a final rule. The issues that I think were raised are ones that the staff seems to have confidence they should be able to address in their environmental impact statement that they're doing right now. My personal feeling was that the court was punishing the wrong people with their action. The court was very upset with the government's inability to implement the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and go forward on Yucca Mountain. They're hearing a number of cases related to Yucca, and I think the court's reaction was, how can you have confidence you're going to have a repository, which is what waste confidence kind of points to, even though it did not point to Yucca. It just said, we have confidence you'll have a repository because we have a law. I think the court's frustration was, we don't believe you because you're being so irresponsible elsewhere. And they basically vacated the rule, which I think is punishing the wrong people, but that's besides the point. I think we'll get through it just fine. Personally, I also think it shouldn't be part of NEPA. Basically, waste confidence should be a legislative fix, because if we do have a law, unless you think the sovereign government's going to disappear, I know they don't implement well on anything, but unless you think they're going to disappear, we ought to assume that they're going to actually ultimately implement the law. And you shouldn't have to deal with this in regulatory and NEPA space. It should just be defined that we have a law, therefore we have waste confidence that eventually it will go somewhere. But we don't see it hurting anybody right now. August 14, we don't think affects any of the new plants on their schedule for going forward because of the drop-off in demand and everything. And even the guys in license renewal, once you filed in license renewal, even if your license, quote, expires while you're in the process, you're allowed to continue to operate. You're in what NRC calls timely renewal. So we don't see it affecting any of the plants.
Do you have a sense of what form the new rule will take? Like how can they, because it's not legislatively resolved.
I think it's going to take very close to the same form it took with better environmental justification on the issues that the court raised. I don't think they're going to make major modifications to the substance of it as much as justify or address the issues that the court had raised, which were relatively limited, really. Other questions? Oh.
If there's nobody else, oh, there's Paul.
Okay. Just very quickly.
You guys going to play ping pong here?
Yeah. Decommissioning. There was some stuff about a large operator having issues about the calculations that were being made with decommissioning, and some dispute, I guess, with the NRC on that. Just sort of more broadly, it does seem like there's a big safe store seems to be sort of the word that's used, and one gets the impression that that's perhaps because the timing allows for the fund to get to a size that would allow for decommissioning. Are you hearing any regulatory concern from the NRC or anywhere else about the level of decommissioning funds and the reliance on something like Safe Store, which, 60 years, long time. Just sort of are you hearing, how should we think about decommissioning and just sort of these latest developments?
Well, how I think about decommissioning is, and I've thought this way for years, is that when decommissioning becomes a business, which I'm not rushing to get to, you'll do it a lot cheaper than anybody's forecasting today because the companies doing it will want to make more money off of it. So that's one reaction I have, Paul. The other is that we're the only entity that actually puts money away to make sure you can decommission. And the NRC reviews that basically annually, and every 2 years requires more feedback from the companies. So I've never worried about having adequate funding. You're right, Safe Store at times allows me to build up money, particularly if I'm shutting down early. But it's also a very viable thing to do. In today's economic climate, I'm not sure I'd want to go ahead and start to do a bunch of decommissioning and also have something else I'm overseeing besides operating the plants that I have safely and reliably. From an NRC standpoint, I think that certainly not at the commission level or at any senior management level do we get any rumblings of concerns on decommissioning. I think that the staff people that look at that have a very focused view, and that's all they look at, and they're always raising issues. But I think in general, the answer to your question is we don't see it as a major problem. I have not looked into the issue that was in the papers in the NRC letter to Exelon.
I don't know if you guys get into the minutia on this or can comment, but if you kind of look at some of the situations that are going on with Vogel and Summer, any type of information you can give us on your thoughts on their ability to get their LAR on the rebar issues. And then also I've heard that there's some issues down in Louisiana with Shaw and the modules and the record keeping there, and whether you know if that's been resolved or not, because I know that's caused a little bit of delays.
I think in the first place, I don't think there's any question they'll get the LAR. Do I think it should be a much more efficient process to get it? Yes. Do I think, and I kind of mentioned it in my prepared remarks, the whole Part 52 when we were doing the front-end licensing to get the COL was a learning experience on both sides. The NRC was learning, the industry was learning, and while you stumbled a bit, I think it actually worked pretty well overall. It should be a lot more efficient when we go through it again. It's the same thing now out in construction. The LAR process and the PAR process, we always knew we would have changes that we needed to manage. And we're learning kind of some of the bumps in the road in change management. And you can tabletop that stuff and you can sort of walk through it beforehand and think you kind of figured out what works. But until you're actually out there doing it, you don't see it working, the way maybe people are actually implementing it. It's about a year after the COLs were issued, and actually I think that both we on the industry side and our colleagues on the NRC side ought to not stop anything, but ought to step back a second and say, okay, what's working well, what's not working as well, and how do we fix it? Because it's not a matter of not doing the right thing, but how do we do the right thing in a more efficient manner? The blessing of Part 52 is you get a combined license. The problem with Part 52 is the NRC's mindset on a combined license is you're an operating plant. There's no fuel on site. There's no risk to the public, but you're treated like an operating plant. And I think that, again, we're learning. So the first part, there's no question they're going to get what they need to get. And could they have gotten it more expeditiously? Personally, I think we should be able to do that, and hopefully in the future we'll get there. I think I don't know enough about what's going on with Shaw, but first of all, whatever is identified goes into the corrective action program. This is how nuclear works. When you run into any sort of QA or QC problems, they go into a corrective action program and you fix it. So this is the process. You kind of get damned because you have processes that identify these things. And to us, it's the opposite. We don't want to miss stuff that ought to get fixed. So you put in processes that help you catch it. And if there's systemic problems, you got to fix the systemic problem. But a lot of this is not systemic.
Hi. I was curious, post-Fukushima, the kind of scrutiny that came up on the industry, the change that happened at the commission with the chairman leaving in somewhat contentious circumstances. I'm just wondering, do you feel that the NRC commission is more sensitive now in terms of taking decisions, whether it's to restart songs or reissue licenses? Do you find that there's a level of increased sensitivity which may delay these processes, or do you feel that the commission working today versus a year and a half ago is following the same pattern?
I think that the commission today is a much more collegial entity. I think the effectiveness of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because it is a commission, is founded upon the expertise, the diversity, and the collegiality. So I think it's got to be a much more effective commission today because they are much more collegial, they're working together. They don't have to agree all the time, but they have to communicate effectively, and I think that that is clearly happening. And I think that makes for better decision-making at the commission level on policy decisions, and I think it makes for greater certainty for us as an industry when the commission is more effective. So I think it's improved.
But do you think they raised the bar on what needs to happen before issuing decisions now versus pre-Fukushima?
I think the bar has always been up there. I think that on post-Fukushima, I think the one thing that, or at least one thing that we would see as valuable is, the near-term task force did its report in June of 2011. It was based upon their first impression of what they learned from Fukushima or what we learned from Fukushima. We are totally in line with them, as I said during my presentation, on the top-tier stuff. When you get beyond that, there's a real question whether some of what was identified 3 months or 4 months after Fukushima is still as relevant today with what we've learned about decision-making and other things that went on at the site then. So we think that there's a number of things that the Commission and the staff at the NRC ought to look at the lessons learned that have come out over the 2 years since and see whether some of the stuff still makes sense, because we're not sure it does. And as I mentioned, one of the concerns we have at our plants is distraction. Okay? People always think it's just money. Well, it's not just money. It's people's attention and focus. The reason we operate the safest, best plants in the world is we are focused. We have very good safety culture. We do very good training. But we're going through change just like your community probably is. We're going to see a turnover of maybe more than a third of the industry over the next few years as people retire. It's a major knowledge transfer. It's a major process improvement. So this idea of cumulative impact and distraction becomes a big deal for making sure that we actually maintain these very high levels of safety. And doing more on stuff that's not as important, which I would say maybe some of what's out there post-Fukushima, isn't necessarily helpful to safety overall at the sites.
Hi, over here in the back.
Yeah, I can't see anybody over there unless I put my hand up because the
That's
lights are
okay.
in my eyes.
I think your point right now just about the safety of the American industry, as you were looking at the international community and the growth there, China is #1, but not perhaps up to our safety standards. So I was wondering what the Institute is doing to support the U.S. supplier or suppliers looking into the export market, and how much you really do work with U.S. Exim Bank or OPIC or other agencies. What else are you doing to support that? Because it's great that we have a wonderful industry here, but there's a wonderful industry to grow towards, and that helps our country's exports.
Couldn't agree more. Like I said, one of the it was a big step forward, maybe not a big accomplishment yet, but we had pushed very hard to get better coordination in our government. We'll never be able to operate like Russia or France, where the government does own everything, and they go forward as a government-operated entity, selling their nuclear reactors, fuel, and other things. But getting somebody on the National Security Council that's really coordinating our government activities. To be honest, getting Secretary Clinton to go and help in the Czech Republic very visibly was a big deal. We're hoping we can get the export control regime improved. We don't want it weakened. We just, again, want it to be more effective and more efficient and focused on the right stuff. Because when people want to buy from us and they think it could take a year to get export licenses, we're no longer as favorable as somebody that can do it in months. So we still have a long way to go. We were in a coalition that helped get XM reauthorized last year, with very good friends in the House opposing it for reasons that we're not quite sure we completely understand. We have met with OPEC on a number of occasions and even the World Bank to see if we can get their policies to be more supportive. So we see the export market as very important, not just for our suppliers to sell overseas, but to help strengthen our infrastructure here. Okay, because the more they're selling overseas, the more our infrastructure here gets stronger. And we do believe we're going to build more plants in this country. So having a stronger, more robust infrastructure later this decade because of what we sell overseas helps. The last thing I'll mention is I'm very biased towards the operations of our plants, and I'll be very clear on that. I think we operate the safest plants in the world. I think we have the best safety culture. We may bang heads with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on specific issues. They are the best regulator in the world. They are the most technically competent regulator. They've done some innovative stuff in risk-informed, performance-based areas. Could we like them to do more like that? Absolutely. But they are the best in the world at what they do. So whatever we can do to sell externally, we bring a safety culture. We may even have our regulator helping the regulators in those countries get better. That can only help us here and help that country and the world use nuclear energy safer and more reliably. So we're very committed to it. There's only so much you can do, but we are very committed to that. Oh.
Regarding spent fuel storage, I have a three-part question. The first one is, do you expect Yucca Mountain to be licensed, and when? Number two, if it's not licensed, what is the most likely contender for a central site? Number three, which nuclear plant in the United States will exhaust its capability to store spent fuel on site, and when might this be?
Okay, I do expect Yucca Mountain will be licensed. I'm hopeful that the court will rule sometime this spring, if not sooner, that the department must go, the NRC must go forward with licensing and the department must participate. Even if for some scientific or technical reason it was determined by the NRC that you couldn't license Yucca Mountain as you went through the process, we believe we should go through the process because we're going to license a repository eventually. And we've spent over $9 billion studying Yucca Mountain. We ought to learn what it takes to license it by going through the full process. So I, one, believe we should do it. I think we will get a license there. I think all the studies would seem to show that. As far as when it would open, I think that's so up in the air on the question of what kind of court challenges. To be honest, even if the court rules to go forward right now, because of Senator Reid and also because the administration is not enamored with it because of Senator Reid, it will be a very slow process because they won't fund it very well. It'll be, dribbles and drabbles as opposed to real funding. So I'm not sure how long, to be honest, it would take. It'll take a long time, is the one thing I'm certain, between challenges and everything else. Now, that's not really an issue because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the industry make sure that we're managing our used fuel safely. We just need to get a program going so we know where it's going to go to, and the American public and our politicians have confidence that something's working. So from a safety standpoint, we don't see that as a real issue if it takes longer. Yucca Mountain and delay is sort of synonymous. I mean, I don't dismiss it as something that's sort of there. The question, I don't think any of our plants are going to be incapable of operating because of used fuel. Okay, we advocate consolidated storage, which is what the Blue Ribbon Commission mentioned, in addition to going forward with the repository. We think consolidated storage should focus initially on the shutdown plants and remove the waste from the plants that have shut down. If a plant had a problem with storage, that would obviously be a way out. We don't see that as a challenge. As far as other potential places for repositories, I think the Blue Ribbon Commission is looking, recommended a voluntary process. That's always, sounds very hard. Who would volunteer? I've been in New Mexico. The people, at least around the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which is a salt deposit that's been taking defense-related waste for more than a decade, would love to become a bigger repository for more defense waste and potentially even commercial waste. They're a long way from getting any sort of concurrence from their politicians or scientific ways, so I wouldn't prejudge where else we could go, but I think we ought to finish licensing at Yucca.
The word delay is an interesting one that sort of goes along with the word nuclear. Years ago, we heard that no new nuclear plant would be begun without a government guarantee. We've got 4 units under construction and no government guarantees. What do you hear about what's going on in the guarantee process? Last I heard, Southern didn't like the terms that they were offered, and South Carolina said, we don't care, we never anticipated getting a guarantee. Any change in that? And if so, for the better or for the worse?
Okay, so just about 3 years ago this time, I had the pleasure of being invited to an IBEW training center where the President of the United States was making a very important announcement about the first conditional loan guarantee to the Vogtle plant. And the President made a very strong statement about that. It was 3 years ago. I am not intimately involved on knowing the details that Carl's asked about on what are the issues on Vogtle. But what I do know is that for at least Vogtle, the loan guarantee is on their balance sheet. It's got the full faith and credit of basically Georgia Power. They got a Public Utility Commission that's doing quarterly prudence reviews and allowing everything to go forward the way it is, and they got a state law that's very supportive. So there's never zero risk, as all of you know, in financing anything. But this is probably as close to zero risk as the government could be taking. And why 3 years later they still haven't acted is somewhat befuddling to me. And I think that it's appalling from the standpoint of the government demonstrating their ability to implement something like a loan guarantee program. Having said that, I've been told recently that they're close to getting to resolution, and the government definitely wants to do this. And at least my understanding is that from the Southern Company side, they don't see insurmountable issues that can't be resolved if the sides sit down and really talk about them. So, Carl, I'm hopeful that they eventually do this, and I'm hopeful that we sort of do a lessons learned on the loan guarantee program and figure out how to make it work right. Because right now, even if they get it, it hasn't worked right, okay? But it's a tribute to both SCANA and Southern Company that they have gone forward spending billions of dollars making the projects go, and they've been able to finance them in the markets.
Along the lines of delay, just want to get a sense for effective and efficient, over here to your far left. Just want to get a sense to your thoughts on the NRC's ability to extend relicensing processes based on well-funded opposition groups that tend to influence state and local policymakers. And does the shutdown of Shoreham play a cautionary tale in telling the story of what happens when nuclear plants are prematurely shut?
Again, I'd never say any agency is apolitical, and obviously the NRC has to deal with everybody's comments, all stakeholders, whether they're anti-nuclear or they're pro-nuclear. But I think the NRC will do the job they need to do technically and draw their conclusions based upon their technical evaluations and end up making that decision. I think Shoreham is an awful long time ago in a very different environment and era from the standpoint of what's evolved since the Shoreham situation as far as the requirements. I mean, emergency preparedness was probably the Achilles heel for Shoreham. Well, our plants have the most robust emergency preparedness of any facilities in our country. Okay, and they have the best support, maybe with a few exceptions, of people around our plants of anything you'd want. So we have tremendous support around the plants with the public. When I mentioned favorability in the 68% range, when you do our surveys around the plants, which we do on a couple-year basis, and you don't survey employees or relatives of employees, you survey the people within the 10-mile emergency planning zone that live there, the numbers are well above 80% on support for the plant because they do know the people that work there and they know the plant. So I think NRC will do the job they need to. They'll obviously listen to anti-nuclear groups as stakeholders, but I think I have confidence that they'll make the right technical decision that they should make based upon the facts at that particular plant. Take one or two more questions if we have.
I have one over here. Why does it take 4 years for the NRC review of an application? What's going on with that, and can that be shortened?
You mean for new plants? Yes. Yeah, why it takes 4 years, to be honest with you, is, again, it's the first time through, and the NEPA review is a long review. I mean, NEPA itself is a long review. Our assessment, and at least the NRC senior management that we've talked with about this, is that if we came back in, it's AP 1000s, they're now certified. If we had an early site permit for the next unit and we came back in with a COL for a new AP 1000 at a bank site, we think you cut it to 2 years because you've got the certified design, you've got the bank site, and you've done the review already for the ones we have. And the 2-year time frame is actually dictated by NEPA. It's not the safety reviews that would dictate it. The safety reviews would actually be shorter than that. So we do see the real value of standardization there from a licensing standpoint. Then we see it on the plant construction. You know, we'll learn a lot more on building the 4 we're building, and we should be able to do construction better when we build the ones after this.
Marv, hi. All the focus has been on the building of like the AP 1000 plants, but every now and then there's companies who talk about, especially a couple in the middle of the country, talk about wanting to look into the smaller reactors. Where do we stand on those designs and that process?
Hey, Barbara, so small modular reactors, there's interest by a number of investor-owned utilities. I can tell you there's a lot of interest by the rural electrics and the public power folks. They seem to have quite a bit of interest in small modular reactors too. We're in the process as an industry of defining, just like we are for greater than 60 for license renewal, we're in the process of defining the regulatory requirements for licensing small modular reactors. That's been going on for a couple of years now. We're probably still a couple of years from getting to final resolution on all the issues. The Department of Energy, as many of you probably know, did a solicitation last year. They ended up selecting one supplier to go forward, and they're doing another solicitation that, to be honest, should be out sometime soon, is what we're being told, to choose probably another, so they'd have at least 2 going forward into the design cert. The earliest that we're probably going to see plants ready for commercial deployment in our country, you know, the DOE program is 2021, if I remember right, and that's probably kind of where we're looking at. It's the early part of the 2020s before you'll have the design cert and you can go forward. We actually, the industry, not just NEI, I think if you talk to the suppliers, they see the big market initially overseas again. Because what they're seeing is there's a lot of countries that do want to go with nuclear because of things like environmental climate change or energy security, where they want to sell what they actually have as domestic resources, but they don't have huge power grids. And big plants don't fit. So I think it's a good technology. It's compatible with the big plants. It's not necessarily in competition with the big plants. And the market there is both domestic and overseas, but it's early in the next decade before we're going to see real deployment commercially with any robustness. And again, this is a case where I think in America, because we're going to certify them and everything else, we may be late to the market overseas if we're not careful, because the other countries aren't sitting on their hands saying, oh, gee, you know, that's not a good market for us. So we're going to have to go forward pretty aggressively. Any other questions? Okay. I thank you all for coming again. It's always a pleasure to see you. And, you know, Richard has his website and his phone number, so feel free to call him or his folks with any questions. And we'll see you again, I'm sure, during this year as things develop. Thanks again for coming.